Hey everybody, Dennis Prager here. The Ultimate Issues Hour is the third hour every Tuesday. Great issues of life. I have a terrific analogy for the importance of the show. It's the map. If you have a map and you know exactly where you are, but you have no clue as to where you should be going, the map is worthless. That's a college education for the most part. It gives you a map of details, but you don't know where you need to go. That's wisdom. There's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. So that's why we have the third hour called the Ultimate Issues Hour. And today's subject is scientists and others' preoccupation with the question of finding life on other planets. Why the preoccupation? I have a theory, but so does my guest. And I don't normally have a guest on the Ultimate Issues Hour, but he's extraordinary. Brian Keating is a professor of astrophysics at the University of California, San Diego. And by the way, looking at his title, I was thinking, if I could have Dennis Prager, professor of astrophysics, or Dennis Prager, syndicated talk show host, I think the professor of astrophysics has more clout. I got to admit it. Now, between professor of astrophysics and professor of gender studies, I'm going to ask, in fact, Brian Keating right now, and then I'll tell you about his book. So, Brian Keating, if you could have as title, Brian Keating, professor of astrophysics or professor of gender studies, what do you think has more clout?
I think cosmic gender studies would be interesting, Dennis.
Cosmic gender studies. Yes, that's right. That's a very good point. Welcome to the show, Brian Keating. You've been on before, and he has also done, by the way, a terrific PragerU course as an astrophysicist and a thinker. What's a greater leap of faith, God or the multiverse? Has over 3 million views at PragerU.com. You should see it. Your kids should see it. And his book is one of the most highly praised science books of 2018. It's called Losing the Nobel, as in Nobel Prize. It's a terrific read. And anyway, welcome back. So there is this. I commented on it on the air, and then I think we spoke about it for a moment, but now we have a chance to really develop it. So I think we resonate that it's not just science that is propelling scientists to look and obsess even over life elsewhere. Is that your take?
I think it's not. You're right, but I think it's not done in a conscious way. I have to say that for most of my colleagues, they are human beings, and as human beings, they have certain biases, and one of them is sort of having this blind spot as to what actually impels us on a day-to-day basis. I mean, if you think about, you said you'd like to be a professor, but, then you have to come to the faculty meetings, right? So I don't know,
All right, I'll stay here.
Yeah.
All right,
the Prager University faculty meetings are much easier. Having been at them, they're much more enjoyable. Yes. Provost Estrin makes them so enjoyable. But the day-to-day preoccupation of a scientist is not to scratch, his or her beard or his beard, and just ponder the cosmos. Even in the case of an exalted, profession like you're making astrophysics out to be. I mean, a lot of it is kind of day-to-day, workaday life, where we're trying to make incremental progress. It's very rare you have a day-to-day, you have a breakthrough as a scientist in any field. And I think this notion that we just go about our days, kind of only searching for truth and knowledge is fallacious, just as it is for any person that's, ignorant of his or her blind spots. So in sum, I think you're right, but I don't think it's a conscious thing. I don't think scientists are setting out. There are many, though, I should say. There are many notable.
Right, but all right, so let's say I asked 10 of these scientists, why are you preoccupied with trying to find life elsewhere? What would they answer?
Well, I think for sure they would answer that they are doing it for the search for knowledge and to understand a curious, fact about the universe and understand, as you say, I mean, what could be more of an ultimate issue than how we as human beings came about? And if that means exploration of other planets, as I hope we'll get into, or exploration of the universe, or as I discuss in my video for PragerU, the multiverse, those are all different scales that we can discuss that impel scientists to answer questions out of genuine curiosity. But I do think, for many of us, there are biases that lurk within us, and those biases are not purely of a scientific sort.
Exactly. So let me just say, for you know my views, but just for my audience and for you to respond, I think a major factor is an atheist element, and that is, you see, humans are not special. There is no God that made the humans. There's a purely natural process that makes life from non-life. It is not a miracle. It is not supernatural, that meaning above nature that has produced it. It happens elsewhere, and if it happens one other place, it probably happened in a billion other places. That's what I think is the animating impulse.
I think that is certainly a subconscious animating impulse. I don't think they set out, although there are some, and we can talk about those, who do cherry pick results and do, fall susceptible to what's the most pernicious bias, in my opinion, which is confirmation bias, which all scientists have to be on guard against, and yet so few of us are, including myself. I'll fall prey to that as well. But the bottom line is that this confirmation, this desire to see any shred of evidence that may confirm the abiogenic, the sort of life from non-life, as you put it, origin of the existence of life forms, that they'll latch onto that, as they did many times throughout even recent history, and maybe we can get into it. One of the most famous experiments in science history, that's often used as an example of the non-necessity for the existence of a supernatural creator is the so-called Miller-Urey experiment. Well, I'm 100 yards away from the Urey Hall at the University of California, San Diego, where Harold Urey worked and did some of these experiments with his colleague Miller in the 1950s and 60s. And this is a Nobel laureate, Harold Urey, and his authority conveyed a lot of weight, and it still resonates to this day, even after the findings have largely been shown to have serious flaws within them. It doesn't mean the overarching idea is wrong, nor do I think it's at this tension that you can only subscribe to one, and the atheists will say that we, who believe in the existence or the potential existence of a divine, a creator of the universe and of life, that they will say, well, that's just the God of the gaps. You cannot understand something, there's missing information, and so you posit, in comes God. But, in my work, as you know, the ultimate gaps, there is no greater gap than the gap between universes and the so-called multiverse. And I hope we can get into this notion that people fall prey to, the love of a theory, or the love and the attraction, almost erotic attraction, to scientific theories, well before they have any evidence in their favor.
Which the multiverse is the best example of.
That's one of the best examples.
Well, and also, just for a moment on that, if I understand it correctly, and obviously you'll tell me, there can't be proof of another universe because we have no access to it.
Exactly. So when we talked last a couple of weeks ago on the occasion of the landing by NASA of the InSight probe on the surface of Mars, you were curious about, what was the importance of this? Why are they keeping to look for water? What's the relevance of this? And maybe in the next, segment or so, we can discuss why is this so important, and what if it's not possible, even in principle, to refute the notion that there was life on Mars? Will scientists stop believing? In other words, it's not enough to not have evidence for something, but once you realize that it's in principle impossible to have evidence about something, do scientists still believe it? And I think, unfortunately, for the integrity of science, many of my colleagues do believe in things that it is essentially impossible to ever rule out. And that is the fundamental test of what constitutes science.
Wow. All right, we'll be back in a moment. Professor Brian Keating, Professor of Astrophysics, University of California at San Diego. And the phone number is 1-8-PRAGER-776. What do you think propels the movement to find water, to find life elsewhere? 877-243-7776.
Oh, it's the happiest season
Hi, everybody. I'm Dennis Prager, and this is the Ultimate Issues Hour, the third hour every Tuesday. Why are some people so preoccupied, obsessed even, with finding life elsewhere? Is the subject, or one of the many subjects, with my professor of astrophysics, at the University of California, San Diego, Brian Keating. His book, Losing the Nobel Prize, one of the most highly praised science books of 2018, is up at DennisPrager.com. He also gives a PragerU course with over 3 million views. What is a greater leap of faith, God or the multiverse? Before we go on, I'd like you to tell me about this. I have a vague notion, but I had no names attached to it. Tell me about the Nobel laureate who's got a building named after him, and what was the experiment that he did in the 50s and 60s?
So, yes, he was a Titanic chemist who did a lot of research at the University of Chicago, and then moved to UC San Diego later in his life and won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of something called deuterium, which is kind of like hydrogen's, heavy older brother. And this scientist, later on in his career, developed a penchant for wanting to affect social policy, and this was sort of after his involvement in the Manhattan Project. And I think part of it was to understand and communicate both the fragility of human life on Earth, and also wanting to agitate for social justice, we would call it nowadays. And this is not uncommon for scientists to want to do that. So here in San Diego, and a little bit earlier when he was in Chicago, Harold Urey, this is, with a colleague named Miller, I think Stanley Miller, they devised an experiment where they took gases that were thought to exist in the early prebiotic Earth's atmosphere. So we're talking, probably 3 to 4 billion years ago on the surface of the Earth. So they conjectured at that time, using the best knowledge they had, what the composition of the atmosphere must have been like. And then they combined that with electrostatic shocks given into this atmosphere meant to mimic lightning, and they found that they could create certain compounds, amino acids, precursors, that many believe are necessary, though not sufficient, to create life in the form of DNA and RNA and so forth. And so this is heralded to great fanfare even back then as an indication of what's called abiogenesis. So the formation of life without requiring a predecessor life form. So the experiment was later, and still is, controversial. It was controversial amongst people that believed in evolution, and then pure creationists debated this wildly, and they still do. It was later found that their methodology was sound, but their assumptions, the initial conditions of the Earth's early atmosphere, were pretty far off from what they knew back then compared to what we know now about what the atmosphere must have been like. So the input, was suspect, even though the output did produce certain chemical compounds that could be seen as necessary, though again not sufficient, precursors to the formation of
all right. You know what? So it's funny. In the recesses of my mind, I did know. I remembered the lightning. I remembered the primal conditions, but I didn't remember what the flaw was. So the flaw was that the more we know about early Earth, the more we understand that those were not the conditions of the early Earth.
Exactly.
Right. Okay. So have they tried to replicate the experiment with the conditions that they now believe existed?
Yes, although nobody had a gas chromatograph. Nobody had existed back then, obviously, to actually assess what was the actual composition. So it'll always
what? They should have called me in. I would have gone, "Let there be light," and end the issue. We all go home.
Exactly.
It would have been just as good, in my opinion.
You're pretty old, Dennis, but you're not that old.
Well, no, it wouldn't even. I'd have to be 4 billion years old, and then I would be able to judge whether the conditions were appropriate. No, it's all right. So let's go back to this search. So there is a sense that, again, we both have, you as an astrophysicist, me as an observer of the world of physics, if you will, and astronomy, that what is the great compulsion to find life is to sustain the argument that you don't need a God, you don't need any supernatural creator. It just happens randomly all over the universe. So is that what is propelling this preoccupation, which is what we talked about with the Mars landing, for water?
Yeah, so I'll take one step back. It's interesting to look throughout recent scientific history at kind of the notions, both in the direction that you just mentioned, scientists attempting to find a non-supernatural God explanation for the origin of life, of consciousness, of technology, etc., and those that, kind of believe, as do many faithfully, religious faithful, that the universe created by God and life itself was set in motion, if not directly directed by a creator. And this has happened so many times. I should say that this abiogenesis, which is a big fancy word, which is broken down to not biological genesis of life. There's a competing theory, and it's called, I hope I can say this on the air, it's called panspermia. It sounds dirty, but it's not. Don't worry. I hope I'm on a 7.
You're fine. You're okay.
Okay,
yeah.
Good. So this was coined by none other than one of the greatest scientists and atheists of the 20th century, a man by the name of Fred Hoyle. And panspermia hypothesizes, in contradistinction to abiogenesis, that life on Earth started because of life somewhere else in the solar system or the galaxy and perhaps even beyond. And the question of whether or not that life had an origin that was abiotic was not answered by him. But Hoyle was an interesting character. In those times, he was a proponent of what's called the steady-state universe, which meant that there was no biblical-inspired or even Big Bang-inspired creation of the universe. He was a die-hard opponent of that theory. And in his amidst his musings in cosmology and in the biological formation of life, he would say things like, the reason that scientists believe, he literally said, the reason that scientists believe in the Big Bang is because they're deeply attached to the theory of Genesis 1:1. Mm-hmm. I mean, today we laugh at that, right? I mean, most scientists, as I say in my Prager University video, 70% of the National Academy of Sciences are atheists. And so it's laughable to think that back then they were somehow oversmitten with the theory of Genesis 1:1.
Right. Let me just explain for everybody the reason that this was Fred Hoyle who said this.
Yes.
Yeah, is that Genesis 1:1 posits in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. In other words, there was nothing, and something came from nothing because of God. So the Big Bang sustains the notion that something started. But if you believe it was always here, you don't need a God. We'll be back. They are the best. I not only know cigars. Oh, I love this. All right, you got to turn it down because I get transfixed by this song. Dennis Prager here, the Ultimate Issues Hour. I do pick the best stuff for cigar apparatus as well. It's all at the Prager store. Great gifts. Speaking with Brian Keating, who not only knows his physics, he's a clear thinker, and he's a delight to talk to and read. Professor of astrophysics at University of California, San Diego. So we're talking about what is animating, what is the propulsion when there seems to be an obsession with finding life elsewhere and even water. We'll get back to the water in a moment. I want to talk to you about the Big Bang. So Fred Hoyle, his theory, he was I did not know this, but it makes sense because of his theories, but he was quite adamant about his atheism. So he believed, from what you said, that scientists who believe in the Big Bang are subconsciously channeling Genesis 1:1 because that posits a beginning and the Big Bang posits a beginning. Do I have that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay.
Essentially, that's right.
Okay, so what currently is the state? If I polled 1,000 astrophysicists in the Western world, and I would say you have two votes. You believe there was a Big Bang, or you believe the universe always existed. How would the vote go?
Well, I think essentially all practicing cosmologists believe in the Big Bang theory.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Wow. Still.
But yeah, so yeah.
All right, what's the but?
Yeah, but the spark that ignited the Big Bang, if you will, that notion is still hotly debated. And that was the universe existing in a pre-Big Bang state or a cyclical state, a quasi-static universe, a modern-day, latter-day version of Hoyle's universe, which instead of being purely steady state and stationary and unchanging on global scales over cosmic history, instead it did go through epicycles throughout history.
All right, then they'd have to vote that so they would say both. There was a Big Bang and the universe always was.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
And
that ties into the multiverse.
So you put that in the same category intellectually as the multiverse?
Well, these are two hypotheses that are diametrically opposed. The multiverse goes concomitantly with the inflationary universe, which stands in contradistinction to the cyclic universe, or this bouncing Big Bang, Big Crunch universe.
Why? They sound the same to me. What am I missing?
So there's a difference between a universe that always was but went through uncountable cycles of collapse and expansion versus the one that had a singular origin. In other words, there was nothing 15 minutes before, not a universe collapsing in a fiery and hellscape inferno, but instead it was nothingness.
Right. So how many? Okay. So how many? What percentage of those 1,000 astrophysicists would say there was nothing before the Big Bang?
Great majority, if I'm using that loosely as a shorthand for inflation, most practicing cosmologists believe in inflation, aka the theory that leads to the multiverse. Most. I would say 97.
Okay. All right. I hate to say this on radio, but I'm lost. I want to understand. It doesn't sound then like anybody believes there was nothing before the Big Bang. Inflationary or the other or whatever you're saying, it's still continuous.
No. In inflation, there's a single beginning of the universe that we inhabit. There may be other universes within the multiverse, but beyond that, if you try to go back, we believe our universe is 13,799,000,000 years old. If you go back an extra 100 million years, there would be nothing.
Oh, okay, all right, that's what I'm asking.
In other words, time itself began.
So I'm confusing inflationary with recurring.
Yes, cyclic. Yes,
cyclic is not inflationary.
Exactly.
Inflationary.
100%.
Okay, good. It's totally clear to me now. So that I did not expect that answer. So in effect, most astrophysicists believe what the believer in Genesis 1 believes in.
Exactly. And that, according to people like Hoyle, makes the scientist in a state of cognitive dissonance.
We'll be back in a moment. Yes, please do. We're at 60% of the goal. All right. Dennis Prager here. It's the Ultimate Issues Hour, third hour every Tuesday. Life on other planets. What animates the compulsion? Everybody's curious, but some are more obsessed than others. My guest is a thinker as well as a scientist, and they are not the same things. It's not an insult. It's not the same thing as almost any profession. Why? Oh, yes. He's a professor. I was reading Why Are Scientists So Obsessed? That's what we're talking about. Professor of astrophysics at University of California, San Diego, Brian Keating. His book, Losing the Nobel Prize, is up at DennisPrager.com, and he has a great video on what's more rational, the multiverse or God, at PragerUniversity.com. So we're talking about the Big Bang, Brian Keating, and what would your colleagues say to me if I said, well, since you do posit something came from nothing, why doesn't simple logic suggest that since we have no parallel for that in our universe, something always comes from something? Why do you rule out the possibility of a creative intelligence that is responsible?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think, along the lines of what Fred Hoyle said, I think that there's a deep, psychological effect that's going on in terms of scientists unwilling, whether or not it's because they believe that science is essentially their God, as many do, as many from the great Albert Einstein on down, the modern era, do believe. And I was actually looking up on Wikipedia, which is not a scientific journal, but they do a good job at compiling, basic facts. But I read the definition of abiogenesis from Wikipedia, and folks can look it up. And it says, although abiogenesis is uncontroversial among scientists, there is still no generally accepted model for how it takes place. That's astounding, isn't it? Because we don't know essentially how it proceeded, or what the preconditions were, what the initial conditions were, what the boundary conditions are to solve these equations, and yet people believe it. And that's the same type of faith.
Wait, wait, I didn't want to interrupt you, but can you read the first sentence again?
So this is about this origin of life from non-life,
right.
One of the most important questions in all of science.
Right.
And the definition in Wikipedia says that although abiogenesis is uncontroversial among scientists.
Well, wait. What are they talking about?
They're talking about the fact that most scientists believe in abiogenesis.
Is that true?
Yes, I believe it's true. Just as most scientists believe in the multiverse, Dennis. I keep telling you.
No.
They believe in it.
Most? Most?
Yes, I would say most. If they don't believe in it, they're not following the conclusions of the inflationary theory as pioneered by its founding father, Alan Guth, who's a wonderful scientist, a good friend of mine. He came up with this theory, and he also says that the multiverse goes hand in hand with the inflationary universe, which is the one that posits also a singular origin for the universe that we observe.
Why? Oh, God. This is no. It's very painful, actually, because the average person wants to believe that scientists are animated solely by the search for truth and that they don't have a prejudice involved.
They want to believe that, but I don't think it's necessarily always the case. There are many scientists who are intellectually honest, and I'm not saying that any of them who do support these theories without a physical model that underpins its origins in mathematics that they would require of any other theory. So for example, you ask about water all the time, and water is actually a very common molecule throughout the universe. We believe it's made up of the most common element, hydrogen, combined with one of the more common elements, oxygen. And that makes it actually very prevalent throughout the universe. And there's a theory that describes how the elements themselves were formed. It's called Big Bang nucleosynthesis, which really, again, all scientific words have simple meanings. It means that how did these elements get formed, synthesized? And that is the standard, gold standard, if you like, of a theory. It makes predictions that can be tested against evidence. And in the case of the multiverse, as I described in the Prager University video, we cosmologists that practice in this craft have no idea how to test it, or even if it's possible, in fact, to falsify it. In other words, to not show that it's right, because that's not what we do. We don't go out and prove things.
Right. Well, that's the atheist science argument. You can't argue for God because you can't disprove it, and whatever cannot be disproved is ruled out of science. But you can't disprove the multiverse, but they rule it in. They
believe it. That's why I say, which is a bigger leap of faith? That's why the title is as it's given.
Correct. So
it's a leap of faith at a core, and I think I'm comfortable saying that. I mean, you would not say that you can prove the existence of God.
That is correct.
And you said that
all the time.
You said that many times.
Correct. I think the evidence suggests it, but I would never say I could prove it. Right.
And you're open. I don't want to get the impression that scientists are all smug and full of themselves and that we have a monopoly on this hubris that we know what we're talking about. Because I often like to take my religiously faithful friends to task as well, as you know, that I believe that if you're a religious person and you want to know the mind of God that you have faith in, why not take it a step further and learn science? Because I do believe in an ideal world, science is the clearest path to understanding the true nature of the universe. And if that includes, a God and maybe a personal God, a benevolent God, etc., then this is the clearest, cleanest path to it. And I call it a form of vitamins of faith that my religious friends, and I have many, that I find that they get turned off, and they turn off their critical thinking skills just as many of my scientific colleagues do. And that's a form of cognitive bias that's susceptible, and scientists are susceptible as well.
Back in a moment with Brian Keating.
Came upon a midnight clear, that glorious song of all.
Hi, everybody. Dennis Prager here, speaking with Professor of Astrophysics at UC San Diego, University of California, San Diego. Author of Losing the Nobel, one of the leading science books of 2018. It's up at DennisPrager.com. Gives a PragerU course on what's more, what is it, more rational or more irrational? Which was it? Let's see.
Bigger leap of
What's
faith.
A greater leap of faith? Yeah, God or the multiverse. God, it's God. I shouldn't even invoke God. Excuse me. Jupiter. You made me aware of something. This notion that, at least is the popular notion, that finding water elsewhere is a great sign of the possibility of life, which may be fine, but you made me realize, I wish I had put two and two together. All water is hydrogen and oxygen in the correct ratio.
Yeah.
So why wouldn't that be ubiquitous?
That's right. Yeah, it is. It is certainly, as I pointed out, to some. If you want to find water, you can go to the surface of the moon. We've already been there. We've discovered without doubt that there's water. It happens to be in the form of ice, but there's plenty of water in our local solar system. And the probes that we send to Mars and beyond looking for it, if they didn't find it, would be a bigger surprise than if they do.
So if you had to bet your royalties from your book, just throwing out something absurd, do you think there's life out there?
Well, my book had to compete with a juggernaut called The Rational Bible, which came out the same month as my book. So royalties were greatly diminished.
I'm sorry.
Like I
don't believe they're in competition.
No, there were 10 to the 500th other books about how evil Trump is, right? So the question is, if I had to bet if there was water on Mars, is the question?
No, life.
Oh, life. No, certainly I don't believe that there's an impediment to life existing. I'll answer your question for the whole universe. But there could be life in the universe. There's nothing that prevents that from happening. The only question I care about is if there's conscious life. And I believe the odds of that are extremely low, if not almost equivalent to zero. And I've asked several of my colleagues, the most prominent atheists, who, by the way, have rebranded themselves. I don't know if you know this. They now call themselves humanists. And I think the reasons why they do so are of interest, but we won't talk about that now. Instead, they say that the odds of life and consciousness, etc., in the universe are high, and the existence of God, the probability of which would be essentially zero. So the odds of the multiverse being true, of life existing, are very high to these very prominent atheists, such as my friend Sean Carroll.
All right, everybody, watch his video, read his book. Thank you, Brian Keating. It is a joy.
Thank you.
The Dennis Prager Show, live from the Relief Factor Pain-Free Studio.